Joined now by Moira Lavelle, independent reporter covering Greece, whose piece in Jacobin is entitled Greece's Election Offers Little Hope for an End to Austerity. Moira, thanks so much for coming on. There you are. We have you right there. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we'll link to your piece in the description so people can read it. But just if you could give us a quick rundown of the elections and where we stand right now, because there was a round, but it seems like, or it appears, in the next few weeks, there's going to be another round of elections. Just from a big picture view, if you could explain that to our audience and why that's the case, that another round is happening so soon.
Yes. So Greece had one round of elections, as you said, on May 21st, so last Sunday. But essentially no party was able to get large enough of a majority to be able to win the parliament. And then none of them were willing to form a coalition with each other. So essentially it was hung parliament, and so they will go to a second round of elections towards the end of June.
And in terms of why those coalitions were unable to be formed, if you could break that down for our audience.
It's interesting. I mean, it's definitely a game of who wants to have control of parliament. You had there's several left parties, and though the largest leftist party, Syriza, was willing at least to form coalitions with the other parties, the two sort of following parties expressed repeatedly that they had no interest in forming a coalition due to political differences on certain policies, but also, as we'll talk about a bit later, blame over how Syriza handled austerity and the crisis here in Greece in the 2015. The party that won. Go ahead.
No. Just to stop you there for a sec. Like my recollection from the time, and again, this is just from an American perspective, was that Syriza was presented as a left-wing populist party, and yet, obviously, as you write about in your piece, there have been some disappointments on that front. But that was like my initial remembering of who they were from a U.S. perspective.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's completely correct, right? When they first came onto the scene, they were the Alliance of Radical Change. Poor translation there, but essentially that. And yeah, it was this party that really gained a lot of popularity after the crisis, the economic crisis, first hit Greece in, say, 2008. So the party that had been the stalwart left party, PASOK, kind of collapsed. And then New Democracy was the right-wing party. Both of them were critiqued with handling austerity and essentially crushing the Greek population with austerity measures. And so from this, Syriza comes onto the scene. And they were elected in 2015, and they had this rhetoric that they were going to be the change that Greece needed, and they were going to help Greece get out from under the thumb of the creditors, and they were going to essentially be this change that Greeks were thirsting for. But then, for a multitude of reasons, they weren't able to bring this change. They were just as beholden, if not more beholden, to the Troika, the creditors, than previous governments. And there was this famous referendum where they asked the Greek public if they wanted to go along with certain economic reforms as laid out, and the Greek public voted no, and then Syriza capitulated, essentially. And so this, paired with many other things, was a major source of disappointment and continues to hang over Syriza. So despite the campaign and the election now, this is very much a miasma on their name that they cannot shake off. And they lost a lot of people in this process too, of those who had been pushing Syriza farther to the left the party at that point. And what I wrote about in this Jacobin piece is that essentially Syriza and all of the other left parties in Greece right now, from what voters were telling me and what political analysts were telling me, is that they just don't have a clear message for voters. What they're arguing is that we are not the right-wing party, New Democracy, which we can talk about in a bit, why people really don't want them. But there wasn't a concrete alternative, right? Like the campaign slogans of Syriza and other leftist parties were about change and a rupture in the system, but they didn't have any super clear policy proposals and certainly no clear rhetoric to back that up. And I think all the parties across the left sort of had this issue of there wasn't something they could argue for, they could only argue against. And there were so many of them that what we saw happen in the election is the left votes were completely splintered among these parties. Syriza lost like 600,000 votes from the previous elections 4 years ago. And the right-wing party, New Democracy, gained some votes, which was enough for them to come out ahead, but not have enough of a percentage to get the parliament unilaterally.
So for the New Democracy Party, the right-wing party here, what parties are they attempting to form coalitions with? I mean, not successfully so far. And what are really the major platform or planks of what they are proposing for Greece? Because the prime minister, right, is of this right-wing party and has been in power for a few years at this point. What have been like the major focuses of both his party and also what are some of the coalitions that they're trying to cobble together in this way?
Mm-hmm. So I will say New Democracy is not trying to form any coalition at all. They have no desire. It's a mess because they have the obligation theoretically to, but they have rejected that. Because in the second round of elections that we will go to at the end of June, the rules change. So it's not just that you need has the highest percentage of votes in the second round will get a cushion of extra seats, up to 50 extra seats in the parliament, so that it's a more theoretically stable parliament and you win more easily. And they have their eyes set on this 100%. They know that if they get the extra seats, they can completely win the parliament. They can have 2/3 of the parliament with this cushion. So a coalition is of no interest to them. They don't need it. But I think it's an interesting question. What was their argument? What was their platform? And their platform prior to the election was one of economic stability. There was the billboards all over Athens were arguing that we're moving forward with stability, and we're going to, bring security to Greece. And it taps into this very real need that Greeks have for some security and stability in their lives. And Mitsotakis, as the prime minister, has really tried to make his name on restabilizing Greece's economy after the crisis. And, they talk a lot about different indicators of how foreign investments rose and the economy is, growing at twice the Eurozone average, and that they have exited the supervision and the controls that were placed over Greece by the creditors. They've now exited this surveillance. So they talk about this a lot, but these markers of economic stability are questionable in many different ways. The GDP is growing, but from what base when you're coming out of such a crisis? And I think the most basic way to explain it is that for your everyday Greek person, this foreign investment or whatever, it means nothing for them. The inflation is through the roof. People cannot pay their bills. Rents are soaring. Unemployment is still super high. I mean, it's not as high as it was at the height of the crisis, but it's the highest it is in Europe. And there's a real cost of living crisis. And so I think, this platform of we're going to bring Greece stability, it speaks to people because they want it, and they have some indicators they can argue that they have achieved economic stability for Greece. But it's really debatable what that means for the average Greek person.
So, I mean, that means that it was pretty incumbent on the left-wing parties to provide an alternate vision in that way. And based on what you're telling me, that seems to have been quite a failure on that front, which is a broader problem, I think, for a lot of leftist parties throughout the world. Could you also just give our audience a greater understanding of what conditions under austerity over the past so many years have been like in Greece, leading them to a political moment where, from what you're telling me, it seems like there's a lot of disillusionment with options and with a way out of the crippling economic conditions imposed on Greece over, the past decade plus?
Mm-hmm. I mean, austerity sort of has its fingers in every part of Greek life at this point, in that there are demands made by the creditors for the government to cut money from here, here, and here. And it's something that comes up constantly. For example, when COVID-19 hit Europe, Greece immediately went into a super harsh lockdown because it was known and very clear to everyone that if and when COVID hit the hospitals, it would be a catastrophe because the hospitals had been bankrupt by austerity measures for decades. And so there was a super harsh lockdown, which was lifted and reinstated and lifted and reinstated. And of course, eventually COVID did make it to the hospitals. And of course, they were entirely overburdened, and the death rate was incredibly high. You also see austerity and the impact of it in this train crash that happened in Greece at the very end of February. There was this train crash where a passenger train collided head-on with a freight train. And it was the deadliest crash in Greece. 57 people died. Many of them were students. And people quickly became enraged because it quickly became clear that the reasons the trains crashed were systemic, that the signaling systems were just not operative, and they weren't operative because despite the fact that workers and the board that oversees train safety, everyone had pointed out to the fact that these signal operating systems were not working, were not up to par, and investment was just never made. And why was investment never made? Because there wasn't money, and because of austerity measures, which also led to the train systems being privatized. So it's this sort of thing of it's every part of public life has been sort of, dictated and controlled by austerity. And it seems that every crisis that happens has some impact, or it is dictated at least partially by the fact that things are underfunded, and then there's a corruption that comes from austerity measures. I mean, I could go on. There was also fires a few years ago on this island of Evia, and the fires raged and burnt like a third of the island. And it became clear again in the aftermath of this horrible tragedy that part of the problem was that the fire service had been bankrupt by austerity.
Yeah.
So it's everywhere. And those are the sort of large scale issues. But of course, your average Greek is seen in the fact that their minimum wage has fallen way below what unions were organizing for 20 years ago. We're not going to be the generation that is paid this much for minimum wage. We're way below that. So I don't know, it's very all encompassing the way it has impacted life here.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm just then want to return back to, the Syriza party and their election in 2015 and the disillusionment that followed. What did not happen and what did happen that led the party that was kind of a bit of a backlash, if I can characterize that accurately, to some of these measures, to caving a little bit to the push for privatization and austerity in a way that might make Greek voters completely just numb to the idea of political change in this way?
I think it's an issue sort of trust being broken, in that since the 70s, when Greece got out of a dictatorship and Greek democracy as we have it now began, there were two main parties that went back and forth, and the crisis came, and it was seen as the symptom of cronyism and nepotism on top of all the other issues that brought, the worldwide economic downturn. And so Syriza was this moment of hope. There were a lot of comparisons with Obama at the time of this change and something super different for Greece, and someone that was, a populist and speaking to what people needed and wanted to hear. And for this Jacobin article, I spoke to this academic, Helena Sheehan. She wrote a book called The Syriza Wave, Surging and Crashing with the Greek Left. She was a big Syriza supporter. And she explained to me that she views this disillusionment and this heartbreak on a systemic level through a more Marxist lens of Syriza was unable to maintain the promises they made because of the international banking systems and the creditors that were making certain demands, and that it wasn't just that promises were broken by individuals, but that it was this global system really trying hard to not let Syriza get a foothold in. And she makes a comparison to the way she sees that Syriza had this name and this notoriety even beyond Greece, right? There was also, Podemos, the Spanish leftist party, were coming to Syriza rallies in 2015. They were seen as this sort of new leftist order in Europe, at least. And again, Sheehan argued to me that this was very scary and needed to be crushed. I think some Greeks I talk to see it that way. Some don't see it so systemically. They see the internal Greek nepotism and the way promises were made and broken in order for Syriza to remain in power, and how, of course, really beautiful rhetoric that we're going to get ourselves out of this crisis, but then at the end of the day, you're still a politician. I think a lot of these things play a part in what happened with Syriza, but I think the one thing that everyone can agree on is that they really are hard to trust and believe in. And I think even people who voted for Syriza, it wasn't with an enthusiasm or a belief that they were going to bring a change. It was more, okay, they're trying to do this pluralist leftist approach of forming coalitions. They're the best option that we have. It was always this sort of, who's my best, worst option?
Right. And that's not always the best, most effective route to actually gaining power, just to say, to say the least, honestly. lastly here, just to return to the New Democracy Party, and I see it described as center right. It seems pretty right wing to me. Feels like they are still poised to be in power in this second round. Is that a good read? And what does the future hold if that ends up being the case? If we still have you.
Yeah, it looks. Oh,
so you just cut out briefly. So, but we have you back.
Okay. Yeah. I heard you, but I got you. Okay. But yeah, no, you're completely right. It's almost certain that they're going to win. I mean, it would be truly shocking to me and everyone else if they didn't. And I think I agree with your assessment of they're right, they're not center right. I mean, it's a little bit splitting hairs, but I think it reveals they're not right wing in Greece, which is a country that had self-declared Nazis in the parliament a few years ago. Okay, so maybe compared to that, they're center right. But if you look at their policies, they're quite right wing, and they have campaigned and lauded themselves in recent years as being the law and order policy, which means that they've increased and invested in the numbers of Greek police, the access Greek police have to universities and to the rest of society. And this has become a huge point of public debate. They were especially violent during the lockdown and then during demonstrations. In a country that does not have the same gun problem as the US, there were 2 police shootings and killings of young Roma men in last year. And though, I mean, there's been a history of police violence for years in Greece, in the past 4 years, complaints of brutality have shot through the roof. And this is something that New Democracy really puts their stamp on of, we are going to continue to increase the police force. This is how we're going to bring law and order and normality to Greece. They also have a very right-wing, very specific anti-immigration policy, vocally anti-immigration. They have pledged to build and lengthen the border fence to cover entirely Greece's land border. At one point, there was a proposal to build a fence in the sea so that migrants could not come over. And more than anything, I think what people see from Greece now is, though the government has denied it, it has been proven time and time and time again by every single journalistic outlet that Greece is illegally pushing back migrants who are trying to come seek asylum in Europe, and in incredibly more violent and systemic ways. I mean, just before this last election, there was a New York Times investigation with a video of an entire pushback, which is a violation of Greek law, of European law, of the Geneva Convention. I've written pieces where I know people who have been trying to get to Greece to seek asylum have been pushed back 10 times. So this is something also that both vocally and tacitly is a real cornerstone of the New Democracy platform. And of course, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, it's okay. I just want to, I mean, for me, it's just, it's so important to point out how this is a part of larger right-wing movements in Europe in general. You're seeing it in Italy. That was the major platform plank there that led to the rise of Maloney, and say in Sweden. I mean, we could go down the list, but we're on a little bit of a delay. I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue.
No, it's okay. Yeah, sorry for the delay. But yeah, no, it's right in keeping with the rest of Europe. And I think this is the right or central right. Mitsotakis, the prime minister, has been called one of Brussels' darlings. He's this sort of technocrat. He went to Harvard. They mention it all the time. That he has this very polished way of speaking, especially in the rest of Europe. He speaks good English. And he seems as a standard neoliberal reformer. But what we see here at Greece is also just incredibly more and more right-wing crackdowns of all sorts of parts of life, be it, on immigration, be it from the police force. Freedom of the press has plummeted in the past 4 years. It's now the lowest in Europe. So there's quite a few pretty standard right-wing textbook moves we see coming from the New Democracy government. And if they win the second round of elections as handedly as they won the first, they'll get this extra pillow of extra seats in the parliament. They could have a 2/3 majority in the parliament, and that could mean that they could change the constitution in Greece, which could mean all sorts of things.
Oh, yeah. Well, to be determined, I guess. Moira Lavelle, independent reporter covering Greece. You can read her piece in Jacobin and definitely her work in the coming weeks as the elections, the second round, comes around the corner. The piece is Greece's election offers little hope for an end to austerity. Moira, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Of course.